Hey guys, Chris from Propel here, and today I wanted to talk to you a bit about carrying kids on bikes, or more specifically carrying kids on electric bikes, because that's primarily what we focus on this channel, but most of the things we talk about will be applicable to non-electric bikes as well. But recently there's been a lot more people inquiring about carrying their kids by bike. I think there's a lot of trends going on that would lead more people to want to get out with their kids and find different ways just to have fun, and maybe more like staycations or just living a little bit more of a local lifestyle. And I'm pretty excited about that. And I think it's interesting that maybe more people are working from home. There's the whole school situation, which is very much up in the air at the moment. So I think finding ways to get around with the kids, maybe teach them about biking, explore different areas around your community by bike. It's a really nice way to go. And more specifically in other areas, maybe like New York City, where a lot of parents are not wanting to take their kids on the subway. They're concerns about, COVID and that sort of thing. I don't want to get too far into that, but just to give you a general sense of like where this is coming from and some of the ideas that I want to talk about. But basically, carrying a kid on a bike, most bikes can usually accommodate them, but there can be some challenges. So, there's a variety of different ways you can carry a kid on a bike. Certainly a kid can potentially ride their own bike, depending if they're able or depending if you feel safe. Particularly in the US here, a lot of streets are really not that safe for biking, and a lot of places are making a lot of improvements there. So a lot of parents feel more comfortable, carrying their kids with them. Other places throughout the world that we've been able to visit, I've seen kids very young riding bikes, with proper bike infrastructure, and they seem to be really safe, and parents feel comfortable with that. I look forward to a future in the States where that can happen more and more, and I think we're moving in that direction, but it takes time. What are the different ways you can carry kids on bikes, right? So there's basically, you have a standard bicycle that you have a rack and you have a rear seat on there, which I'll get into a little bit further in just a moment, but I'll just give you an overview right now. You can do a trailer, for example. So you tow the trailer behind, which you can usually carry either one kid or two kids, depending. Then you have some bikes that are specifically designed to carry kids. So you have what's considered like a cargo bike, for example, and some of them will carry one kid, some of them carry one kid or potentially a larger kid, but some of them will carry two kids or sometimes even more than two kids, 3, 4, etc. So it really depends. And my plan is to kind of dive a little bit deeper into each one of those different types of carrying techniques, I guess you could say, and explain a little bit about the pros and cons of that. And hopefully that might serve as a helpful guide for you to make a decision as to what's going to be best for you and your family. So first, just getting into this most common setup, which is just basically adding a seat to the back of your standard bicycle. Now, there can be some limitations, and it really generally comes down to the weight capacity of the rack. For the most part, a lot of these seats weigh somewhere between 5 to 10 pounds, on average, somewhere around 8 pounds. And then the capacity of those seats, these child carrying seats, are usually somewhere around 40 pounds up to somewhere around 50 pounds, or even you have some which are made for older kids that can go up to 60 plus pounds, although they're not as available in the States, although some people sometimes import them. One that used to be very popular in the States called the Yup Junior. It's actually not possible to import it into the US right now, which is a bit troubling, but there's other ones out there, and they're usually called junior seats. I will say that the Dutch and other areas in that region, they seem to be most experienced with this sort of thing. We got to visit the Netherlands pretty recently, and you see people taking their babies around in a cargo bike and that sort of thing, and really there's very little restrictions, and most people don't actually have cars, so the idea that you can, just carry your kids from a very early age, and that just is a way of life there. And I think a lot of people are adopting that way of life here as well, which is pretty cool. Most rear racks, I think, are not really designed with the idea of carrying a child seat on them. And that mostly comes down to the weight capacity of the rack. Now, many racks can accommodate somewhere around 40 pounds. So if we think that a child seat can weigh somewhere between 5 to 10 pounds, say 8 pounds on average, and then the child carrier can carry up to 45 pounds, then basically you have this total weight of over 50 pounds up to somewhere around 55 pounds, could be even higher with some of the seats that even go up to like 48 pounds and it weighs 8 pounds. So, but somewhere in that area, 55 pounds, say. So if you have a 40-pound rack, really, it's not really intended, and actually most of these manufacturers, or some of the more notable manufacturers like Thule or now Yep, which was bought by Thule, and then you have some other companies, they'll actually say specifically, this is not meant for a rack with this lower weight capacity. You need to have a capacity of at least 55 pounds in order to accommodate this whole system and to be intended for that purpose. Now, certainly I've seen people put those seats on racks that have lower capacities, but it's definitely not recommended because they're not made to carry that weight. So that's an important consideration, but I think for a lot of people that just makes sense because maybe you're planning to just carry your kid on the back occasionally, you don't really want to have a larger bike, you don't want to have a bike that's specially made to carry a kid. You just want to be able to go out and enjoy yourself on occasion with your child. So it might be the case that you need to fit a rack on the bike, or maybe some of the bikes might have a rack that's specifically made to carry this heavier weight. We do carry some single passenger bikes that have a rack that can accommodate up to 60 pounds, and that would be very fitting for carrying a child seat. If it has a weight capacity of 40, 45 pounds, in theory, yeah, maybe you can put a 5 to 8 pound seat on there and then carry 30 to 35 pounds of child inside that seat. We wouldn't really recommend it, but people do it, sure. So it's something to be mindful of. And I think that a lot of people, rightly so, are thinking that safety is really important. You're carrying your precious cargo here, and something important to consider. So I just want to introduce some of those ideas and get you to think about that. It's not always the case that you necessarily need to put the child seat on a rack. Actually, there's several different models which are specifically made to mount on the frame without a rack, so it's all kind of one complete system. And Thule or Yep also has available this version that mounts on the seat tube. So instead of mounting on the rear rack, it actually attaches an adapter to the seat tube, and then there's basically these like bars that come out, and the child seat is attached there. So then you're not worried about your weight capacity on your rack, and you have a little bit more flexibility. But I do want to note the limitations of that system, and it mostly comes down to specific types of bike frames. Not all of them have the appropriate clearance or space to be able to accommodate that adapter, so it's not the case that those will fit on all different bikes. So those are the rear seats, and those generally are going to be able to carry kids in a variety of different weights. The one thing I didn't mention is really thinking about how old the kid should be. I mean, I think that this topic comes up a lot. They say, well, how old does my child need to be in order to sit in one of these seats? Or, how tall do they need to be? And what most people generally say to sit in this type of seat is generally recommended that the child can hold their head up on their own. So if they're kind of having trouble holding their head up, that's not really a very safe position. They should probably be leaning back, maybe inside of a car seat sort of setup, a more carrier that's fit more for infants and toddlers. But as the child is able to hold their head up and perhaps wear a helmet and that sort of thing, sitting in that type of seat is generally a bit more fitting. But there's other seats that are made for smaller children, and they don't go on the rear rack. They generally go up front. There's a variety of different companies that make them. Now, I'm using Thule and Yep in most of these examples. That's just mostly what we carry in the shop, but there's many other companies that make these types of systems as well. There's a lot more options available on the international market, but there are different safety standards, and I think that sometimes the international market, specifically the European market, is much larger, so sometimes these companies, I think they don't want to go through the extra trouble of certifying their products to be sold in the US. They have to go through all the extra testing and everything like that. So if you're not large enough, if your distribution network is not large enough, then it might not always make sense. Don't think that Thule is the best one just because I'm mentioning or bringing it up a lot. And I know that there might be different ways to pronounce it as well, but we get into that a lot when we talk about European products and names, but I just kind of go with my pronunciation, and somebody can correct me in the comments, please feel free. You have this seat called the Yep Mini, which goes up by the handlebars, and that's generally for a much smaller child. The nice thing with that is you can see the child a lot better when they're in front of you. Yeah, it's just the seat is made for a smaller child more specifically, so it kind of holds them a little bit better in that way, and it's more proportionate. Now, again, talking about different bikes and more specifically electric bikes, a lot of times there's limitations. You have specific parts on the bikes that might be unique to electric bikes, or you have displays or all these different things. Continuing on the theme of looking at just single passenger bikes and the different adaptations you might be able to make to them to make it easier to carry a child, you also have the option to maybe carry a trailer. Now, this might not be fitting for all environments. Like, for example, New York City, using a trailer is not that common because the car traffic is so much and it's so dense that sometimes the visibility is not as good, so it might not be as safe. And I think many parents feel that having the children inside of a trailer, particularly riding with traffic or something like that, might not feel as safe because you don't have as much control. There's not as much visibility because they're generally much lower down. Now, there's certain safety precautions that are generally taken. Oftentimes the trailers are more visible, brighter colors. That's definitely helpful, or sometimes they'll have flags on them. Those trailers, generally, they'll accommodate upwards of somewhere around 100 pounds, and that could be good for one bigger child or perhaps two smaller children. It's not a bad option for a lot of people, and I think that for recreation riding, this is a really nice way to go because maybe you can go to a park or some type of specific bike trail and you can have the children in the back and you're not really concerned about cars and that sort of thing, which could be a threat to the safety of your children. You definitely want to be mindful of that. I don't want to scare you and continue to bring these things up, but I think it's important to consider these factors, and safety really needs to remain as a very important detail. I should also note on the safety factor that wearing a helmet is generally required, particularly for children, pretty much throughout the US. I know that in some places throughout the world this is not a requirement, but in the US it generally is. And as I mentioned before, the other thing that I mentioned about the age of a child, certain states do have requirements for that. Like New York, for example, the child needs to be at least 1 year old, but there are certain other places where there's not a specific requirement, and there are ways that you can carry children inside of a car seat. And I guess my thought process is I don't know that actually the safety is all that much different if the child is, or the infant is inside of a child carrier that's intended for a car that has a lot of structural integrity there, and then in an ideal world, something like that, you'd have it inside of a structured box like a front loader, which we'll get into in just a moment. These like kind of purpose-built cargo bikes that are really intended or made to carry kids. To wrap up the single passenger bikes that you can adapt to carry kids or carry trailers, etc., I think that that's the general idea there. However, I will say that we're starting to see more and more bikes considered like just standard bikes, but maybe they have that ability to carry kids, but they can do a bit more. And I think that the difference here is that Generally, if you want to carry a kid on the bike, a lot of times you might have limitations to be able to also carry cargo. And I think there's some bikes out there that are able to do this a little bit better. We work with a couple of companies that are kind of moving in this direction. One of the most notable ones is Turn. So they have a couple different bikes that are a little bit more fitting, that you can carry a child seat and the rack's a little bit longer, so maybe you can also carry some bags with it. They also make it a lot easier to set up like front baskets, that sort of thing. If you think about it, one of the common scenarios that people will use a bike to transport a kid is maybe they're bringing the kid to school and you need to bring their backpack or something like that. So the idea that you have the ability to carry the kid, but you have a challenge carrying a backpack or their school supplies, having additional space to do that is really a big deal, an important consideration if that's your use scenario. So if that is your use scenario and you're really looking for a small bike that can carry one smaller child as well as their stuff, I think looking at these kind of crossover bikes, I guess you can almost call them, it's like, sometimes we use these terms which are borrowed from the automotive industry. I think that a lot of times people are most familiar with that sort of terminology. But if you think about it like a crossover car, it's somewhere in between a car and an SUV. It's not like a full-on SUV, but you could think of some of these bikes like that. One of them I would say is like the Turn HSD. Was released pretty recently, and it's very notable that it has that ability, and then it has all sorts of adaptations to the bike that will allow you to carry the child well into their teens and that sort of thing, because it can accommodate up to 130 pounds. That's a pretty significant difference than the standard 40, 50, maybe 60 pounds on the higher limit of some of these standard bicycles. Another one is the Benno eJoy. This bike's fairly popular. It's not available right now, but I think there's more coming next year. And I think that this is actually an overall philosophy of Benno, which is like, regular bikes or regular e-bikes that can do more. And I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think it fits a lot of people's lifestyles. But there's also scenarios where people want to be able to carry more than just that, and I intend to talk about some more of those purpose-built bikes. So you have that standard, single passenger bike that you can adapt with seats and trailers, etc. But there's bikes that are actually built for the specific purpose to be able to carry kids or cargo or a variety of those too. This is a whole classification of bikes that we consider to be cargo bikes. I think there's different ways you can define, like any bike could be considered a cargo bike in some ways, but in this specific example, I'm going to define a cargo bike as a bike that can carry over 100 pounds. Now, I just mentioned a couple of them. The Turn HSD, very popular bike, really great for carrying kids. You have the ability to put a seat on the back. Now, that one will just carry one seat, but you also have the ability to adapt what's called the captain's chair, and that seat will kind of carry upwards of the full 130 pounds. Maybe it's more in the 120-pound range once you add the attachments and the additional weight of that seat. But having that ability to carry more is really great, and many of the bikes in the Benno lineup are kind of similar. So you have the eJoy, you also have the Scout, which are both kind of more standard bikes, but they can carry more. But then you have a new model from them called the Remy Demi. Now, since its introduction, there hasn't been that many accessories available for it, for carrying children and carrying smaller children and that sort of thing. But to my understanding, there's a lot of things coming there. And this seems to be the trend that many of these manufacturers are going into, because I think it's very fitting. I know in my experience in New York, a lot of people would feel that, hey, I can do just fine riding my bike around the city, even getting over the bridge, which tends to be one of the larger hills in New York City, which, there aren't really as many hills. I mean, at least in the heart of the city, as you get further uptown Manhattan into Queens, etc. There definitely are areas that are hilly, but a lot of times people use the bridge as like the one indicator, like, oh, maybe I need electric assist. And then if you add kids on there, so a lot of times people say, well, I can carry myself and my small child, but once they start getting like over 25, 30 pounds, it starts to become a pretty big chore, and you start to feel that. It's just like, oh, wow, like, really starting to struggle going uphill and that sort of thing. And certainly you can, gear down and maybe you can do better at that. But a lot of people are not really thinking about bikes like that. They're thinking of them as more utility and just an ability, a more efficient way of getting around the city. So the idea that, oh, well, I have to find a way to do it on my own power, I don't know that, why. I don't know. It's just they think that it makes sense to just use tools that are right for the job. And from my experience, from my perspective, electric assist bikes are really good for the job, and more specifically, electric assist cargo bikes are excellent for the job. Now, speaking specifically in New York City, one of the limitations a lot of people have is space. They don't always have an indoor space to store their bike, so that's a big challenge when we're kind of thinking about this. And Tern does an excellent job because their bikes are pretty compact, but they can still do quite a bit. Some of the other manufacturers, their bikes are a little bit larger, and you kind of have to think about different ways of like where I'm going to store this thing. So you start with these like kind of mid-size cargo bikes or crossover bikes or whatever you want to call them. And then you can go into the largest bikes, which are like, the bucket bikes or Bach-Fiats, which are, generally front loader bikes. Sometimes they're three-wheelers, sometimes they're two-wheelers. And those bikes are excellent for carrying kids. You get excellent visibility of the kids while you're riding. I tend to recommend them quite a bit. And it's nice because you're riding, you can see the kids, you can see everything you're going, the kids can see ahead of them. They don't have their field of view limited at all. And a lot of people really appreciate that, but that doesn't fit everybody's lifestyle. Like I said, storing the bike can be a big challenge. I know many people just put a cover on them and lock them up outside, but also many people don't specifically live in New York City. That's not the only place that people live in the country or in the world. So, maybe some people are gonna just park their bike in the garage. Maybe they're gonna replace their car with the bike, which is quite nice if you ask me. You have these kind of single passenger bikes that you can add seats to. Then you have these kind of like multi-passenger bikes, but maybe they're intended to just carry one additional passenger. But then you have these bikes which are intended to carry more than one additional passenger. And many of those can often carry upwards of 200 pounds of additional cargo, which is pretty significant. So that might be 2 smaller kids on the back, that might be 2 larger kids, that might be a medium-sized adult. I would generally define the bikes in 2 different categories. So you have like a long tail, mid-tail, and then you have the front loader. Front loader, the cargo is going to be in the front of the bike, and the long tail, mid-tail, the cargo is going to be in the back of the bike. And you can often, with the long tail, you can often add that smaller seat up front as well. But for the most part, most of the cargo is going to be in the back. And the nice thing is there's often many adaptations, or the trend is to add more and more safety features, and that can include wheel guards, it can include some foot pegs for the kids to put their feet as they get a bit older, maybe they grow out of the seat. I'll just call out a couple of different models, or the models that are most popular in our shop, and we can just talk about some of these different variants and how they work. There's many other models that are on the market as well, but this is what I'm most familiar with, and this is the best way I can explain how these different bikes. So if we're starting with just an extension of this standard bike that can do more, a little bit longer, etc. I mentioned the HSD, and I mentioned some of these different Benno bikes. If we stick in the Tern lineup, you go from the HSD, and then you have the GSD. The GSD has been a very popular bike for us. It's what I would consider a mid-tail or compact cargo bike. It can carry 2 kids on the back, or carry a smaller or medium-sized adult, because it can hold up to 440 pounds, which is pretty significant. Now, there's all sorts of attachments for the back there. You can put 2 seats, you can carry kids inside of their passenger carrying system, which is generally these bars that go around the outside. This does a really good job of protecting the kids, keeping them contained, and you could feel safer that they're within that protected area. Many other bikes have similar sort of adaptations. Another brand that we work with, it's called Extra Cycle. They've been one of the early members in this cargo bike scene. They actually, many would say that they kind of introduced this concept of a long tail bike, and they did that in a variety of ways. One, they started with this attachment system, but ultimately they started making complete bikes. Now they make a variety of different complete bikes that can carry 2 seats, or you can use the bars that go around the back. They call it a hoopty, which is kind of funny name. And then you have many other brands. Benno has been very popular in our shop. They have a model called the Benno Boost. This is Benno's kind of flagship model, and it's available with all different options, all different attachments and bags and side skirts and different lower deck rack options. So if you wanted to do like really heavyweight carrying, you can just do anything. And then there's different baskets in the front, and you could really see that these bikes are intended to carry cargo. They're intended to carry kids, and there's a lot of attention to detail paid in how these bikes are set up. They often have special kickstands that are set up on them to make the bikes more stable when they're being loaded and unloaded and that sort of thing, which is an important factor to consider, especially when you have more than one kid on the bike. But even having just one kid on the bike, having that bike straight up and down and stable is an important detail. And Benno does a really great job with the kind of more sporty style bikes, which is kind of nice. It's this like in between for carrying cargo, but it still rides really great as a normal bike. The wheels are a little bit larger. Another bike in this similar category is the Riesemuller Multi-Charger. This bike was actually just recently updated, and they have all sorts of different options for this. You can get it as a high-speed bike, which might to some people sound a bit crazy to carry kids, but maybe you're carrying the kids and you're not riding as fast, and then on the way back from dropping them off at school, you want to just get to work quicker, why not? So that bike, you also have the bar system around the top. They call it a safety bar. You have the ability to drag a bike with you, which I think a lot of people appreciate that option. I know I have one customer in particular that he will ride his child on the back of the bike, tow their bike with them, and then once they get to a safe trail on the way to school, he takes the kid off the bike and puts him on his own bike and rides until they're getting back to they have to ride on the street and switch it back up. So there's different ways that you can use these systems, and it's pretty cool. And there's a lot of these improvements that are happening over time, and there's more and more bikes being introduced all the time into this space. But we tend to work with the ones that we know are proven, that we know that they're doing the safety tests that are not always required, but I think are really recommended. And I think that's an important detail to consider, is like the reputation of these companies, because sometimes there's like really cheap stuff out there, and sure, yeah, it can carry your kids, but do you want to trust the safety of your kids in one of these very low quality bikes? I just be mindful of that, because they're generally going to cut corners in some areas, and I think that that's not so smart. But totally, I understand if people have budgetary limitations and they want to be able to carry a bunch of kids, and they might not always be able to afford it. But there's different things you can do. Some people might consider the option of financing. I know for some people that's not really within their beliefs or whatever the case may be. But maybe you can opt for a used bike or something like that. From my perspective, it would be better to get a used quality bike than to get a new, low quality bike. So we talked about these mid-tail, long-tail bikes. I next wanted to go into this front loader bucket bike or Bachfiat style bike. And there's many different versions. So some of them will have 2 wheels, so front and rear wheel, and just a big bucket up front. Some of the notable ones that we offer are the Riesemuller Load. The Riesemuller Load's available in 2 different varieties. It's the Load 60, which can carry 2 kids, or it can carry a single kid in a baby seat. We talked about this before, that you can basically take a seat that's made for a car, put the child in there, and then put it inside the bucket. And I think that that's kind of cool. I don't personally have kids, but I think that if I did, I would do that. I don't know if my spouse would trust me to do that, but so the load, you can carry the 2 kids or a car seat. The Maxi Cozy is a pretty popular one that's used, and there's a special adapter that you can mount the seat into the base of the bed there. They have the Load 75, which is a bit longer, and that one can carry 3 kids up front, so 2 in the back and then 1 facing the rear, which that one, it's pretty nice because even as the kids grow larger, or you could potentially carry 2 medium-sized kids facing each other, and we've even carried full-size adults. Tara, our videographer, we often ride in that bike, or sometimes we take the Load 60 depending. But I like this one in particular because it's full suspension. If you ask me, like one of the safest, most comfortable bikes probably would be the Load. I'm just a really big fan of that one in particular, and it's the bike that I quite often use personally. Reese & Mueller also just released a bike called the Paxter 70. The Paxter 70 is what's considered a hardtail bike. It doesn't have rear suspension, but it has many really special features to it. They have a whole new carrying system up front with the reinforcement bars, and they use an EPP foam, which keeps it relatively lightweight but very well protected. And that bike can be set up with 2 seats in the back or 1 in the front, so up to 3 kids. And I guess in theory you could also potentially even put a seat on the back if you wanted to go really all out and have a total of 4 kids carrying on that bike. But I'm really excited about that bike. They also have a belt drive on there available with some different drivetrain options. One of them is a fully automatic transmission, which is pretty cool and I think pretty fitting for the kid carrying type of bike. But this bike is just recently released to the public, but we'll probably start to see them in the shops later this year, but it's definitely a nice consideration. They have one other model called the Paxter 40, and that bike is a little bit shorter up front, and it's intended just to carry 1 kid, but you can carry a bit of a taller kid. Again, cargo bikes, they can tend to be a bit more cumbersome, but this bike actually, the footprint is not much larger than a standard bicycle, but it has that ability to carry a bigger kid, and you can see them, which is one of the nice things about these front loader style, that you can look at the kid while you're riding. In this case, they'd be facing backwards, similar to the 3rd seat on the Load 75 and the Paxter 70. But it's a really nice way to go if you want just a more compact bike. Maybe you have space limitations, or you just want something smaller because you're just carrying 1 kid. Another really popular bike for us in the shop is the Urban Arrow. It's probably one of the more popular bikes on the market as a front loader, or as an electric assist front loader. This bike they have in a variety of different options. They have one which is called the Shorty, which is their kind of short version. It's kind of similar to the Paxter 40 in some ways. It's intended to just carry 1 child, and the configuration of it is kind of interesting. Then they have the Family, which is really the most popular version of this bike, and that bike is set up by default out of the box, really can just carry 2 kids, and it has all the features that you might need or want in a cargo bike, and it's a pretty affordable option, which is nice for a front loader because they can tend to be a little bit more expensive because they're a little bit more complex, a little bit more expensive to ship. Urban Arrow Family is definitely a nice way to go. You do have the ability to add an additional bench in the front, so you can carry up to 4 kids in the back. And you can add a rear rack to the bike if you wanted to carry even an additional child. So with this bike, you can get up to 5 kids total, which is pretty significant. And they do also have the option to carry a baby seat up front, or the car seat, which I don't know if it's considered of a car seat if it's not being used in a car, but maybe somebody can give me a different word to use next time on that one. You have, it's specifically made, I guess it works really well with the Maxi Cozy. And we were in Amsterdam recently where Urban Arrow is located, and you see these things just all over the place, and it's really cool. One of the other nice things about these front loader bikes I should mention also is that many times they have these rain covers, which is really nice to keep the kids protected in harsher conditions and wet weather in the winter, etc. because many people do use these bikes all year round, snow, rain, etc. And it's definitely possible. If the conditions are really severe, you might want to opt for different tires. Some people say like, it's not bad weather, it's just bad clothing. It's like, you can always dress a little bit better for the weather. So those are the two-wheeled front loaders, or those are the ones that we offer in the shop, and that I'm specifically a big fan of. I feel like they're the best for a variety of different reasons. There are definitely other ones on the market, but those are the ones that I specifically recommend. There's certainly other ones you can consider, and are plenty of them are probably of decent quality, but we can only do so much. So I don't want to give you the impression that we're just saying, oh yeah, everything else out there is terrible, but there might be one or two reasons why we choose not to carry those particular brands. Or it might just be that they're not available in our market, which certainly is the case with many products, which the main market tends to be for these type of cargo bikes in Europe, so not all of them come here, or they don't always come here easily. But sometimes we take extra measures to bring the bikes over. One of the bikes that we actually bring over ourselves is called the Butchers and Bicycles. Now this is a three-wheel cargo bike. It's a kind of special three-wheel cargo bike in that it leans. Generally speaking, you have a three-wheel cargo bike, it doesn't lean. And what happens is when you're turning the bike, when you're going around a corner, the bike can naturally tend to tilt and almost like kind of want to tip over a little bit. People that are really experienced riding, they'll tend to like balance their weight to the opposite side that they're turning to try and offset this natural tendency of the bike. But Butchers and Bicycles, they design their bike in such a way that it's, as they call it, built to tilt, and basically as you're riding around the corner, the bike will tilt with you. And the Butchers and Bicycles has these springs. As you lean, there's kind of a reverse rebound to them, so you can adjust it as to how much you want to allow it to tilt, or how firm you want it to tilt to be. The softer that it is, the easier it's going to be to take turns at speed. The firmer that it is, it's going to be a little bit more stable at lower speed. So that's kind of a cool option. I think a lot of people are very interested in that because they tend to feel that a three-wheel bike will be a little bit easier to carry a load. And that's generally the case, but you'd be surprised how well many of these two-wheel bikes handle. And I think that's the other thing I guess I didn't mention so much before, but in thinking about a two-wheeled setup and how that handles, it's really nice because the weight is so low, the center of gravity is really low, it's really easy to handle. As the weight goes up higher, you kind of get this lever effect a little bit, so it becomes a little bit more exponential as the weight is kind of pushing you side to side. But the Butchers and Bicycles, really awesome bike, a lot of different options. Some people use it to carry kids, sometimes people carry dogs or just other cargo, but it has 2 seats. You can also put a seat on the back, which is another option if you wanted to carry more than 2 kids. Sometimes people even put 2 kids on the seat and then in a pinch put a kid on the floor or something like that. It's not something I would generally recommend, but I just know that that's something that's common that people do. And the Butchers and Bicycles also has the fully automatic transmission available, as well as the manual version. I think the manual one's good if you want to ride a bit more sporty and you want a bit more control over your gears, but the fully automatic one is good for parents that just don't want to think or worry about the gears at all and just ride the bike and just worry about the kids and just the safety of your ride. There's many other cargo bikes that are out on the market. I don't have as much personal experience with them. I tend to look for just like the best ones out there, and that's generally what we'll offer in our shop. But I really recommend you consider that, because it's a nice thing is you can start with the kids as they're young and then they can grow into it. And in certain places we see people carrying their kids into their teen years. I mean, if you think about it, in a place like New York, a lot of people would think like, oh yeah, carrying a kid into their teens, like 12 years old, 13 years old, something like that. That sounds like, that doesn't really make sense. Shouldn't the kid be like, riding on their own? But it's not always safe to do that, and I think a lot of parents want to be able to ride their kids, and they might feel safer just to be able to carry them. And to have a bike that's capable of doing that is pretty nice, and there's more and more available out there. And with the electric assist, it makes it easier to carry that heavier load. So I'm sure there's other things that maybe I might have missed. Feel free to leave them in the comments below. I would also recommend, there's loads of great resources out there on the web. One of them in particular is Facebook groups. I know not everybody is really all that excited about Facebook, but I will say that there are certain groups out there that are just so much information, so many really helpful people there. Some of the different bike brands that I mentioned, Turn, for example, they have a couple of their own groups. They have the Turn HSD, the Turn GSD group. If you search on Facebook, you can find them. Some other notable ones that I've found is like the Cargo Bike Republic, which I think was started here in California, but it's really a national group of people on Facebook, and they're always talking about different bikes and stuff like that. There's some that are like named like Pedal Parents, and other ones. There's one that there was a movie actually. This would be kind of cool. You should check out. It's called Motherload, and they have a Facebook group called Motherload, and then there was a documentary movie which we'll link to below, and you can watch that movie. It talks a little bit about like how cargo bikes started, the founding of them, and the different people that were involved in it. A lot of these things happen, as I mentioned before, like Extra Cycle, and then later Yuba, and certainly there was other cargo bikes that are on, the market before that, and some of them go back, to the early days of bicycles. But that video is really cool, and that group's really cool. I mean, all these groups are pretty awesome. And I really enjoy participating in them. As I said before, I don't have kids specifically, so I always enjoy like working with people, learning from them. You find parents do all sorts of wild things to make their kids more safe, more comfortable. They're putting all sorts of adaptations to their bikes to make them work better for their lives and for their family, and I really appreciate that. And just, you got to keep in mind, like, this is a pretty new market, and so there's a lot of things that are just starting to be introduced here and starting to evolve, but I think it's moving quickly. There's more and more interest, and I think as more and more people are starting to live a more local lifestyle, and many people are starting to give up their car, it's really pretty cool to see like the tools that they're using to make that work better for them. So yeah, again, I hope you guys found this to be useful. If you have any questions, comments, something I missed, some resources that you want to share in the comments below, that'd be really great. And I look forward to seeing you guys in future videos. If you got any video ideas that you'd like to see, just let me know, and we'll see you soon.